This is The Freedom of Self, Guide to Enlightenment Handbook. Contents. Chapter 1. What is the Self? Chapter 2. Am I free? Chapter 3. Unshackling the Self. Chapter 4. The Journey of the Unshackled Self. Chapter 5. Reshackling the Self. Chapter 6. Nurturing the Self. Chapter 7. Ego and the Self. Chapter 8. Suffering and the Self. Chapter 9. Healing and the Self. Chapter 10. Self-love. Chapter 11. The Freedom of Self. Chapter 1. What is the Self? Upon review, we hear the word self quite often, but when dived into more deeply, what is self? Well, in terms of a dictionary definition, it is referring to one's identity as one, an individual. In terms of psychiatry, it is our identity. Psychologically, however, the self is much more complex, however, still based off of the first two definitions. The self, in terms of psychology, is our persona, the purest essence of who we can be, which can be extracted like a type of special magic, and we can use that extraction to change the lives of ourselves and others, which is the magic. When reviewing the self under these contexts, the self becomes much more intrinsic in value compared to the tired old self we so often hear about. In a way, the self is almost like what religion sees as the soul, both equally driven by spirit, almost a second version of us that we can wear or change at any time. As a mechanism of persona, the self realizes itself and acts through us simultaneously. Anyone who denies the self is denying themselves, so they usually don't. Chapter 2. Am I free? Are you free? That is up to you to decide. Only you know your true self. And where you can be that is your freedom. Say you and another person both get taken hostage. You might consider it hostage. The other person may see it as an opportunity to join forces with the perpetrator. There is good in the world as well as bad. In the end, you will settle with one, and that will be your freedom. Yourself will never change without you. So in that context, you are free. Only you can change your own mind. We tend to come into this life shackled in chains that cannot be broken, and that drives our perception. Why? Because those shackles are our external perception. We need to loose those bonds before we can drive our own external perception. Chapter 3: Unshackling the Self. To loose the bonds of the shackles of our external perceptions, to release our self into the world, sounds to many more easily said than done, correct? In that way, it can be. The truth of the matter, though, is that you are the only one who holds the keys to the shackles you wear in the first place. The question then remains, what is stopping you? You may have external threats that you feel is keeping you from it, but those threats are just taking that for granted. In the end, it is still up to you whether to allow yourself to be set free, and with time, you will begin to see physical change in that direction. The immediate power of releasing oneself is an immediate change of perception, both yours and others. When the self is set loose, all the doubts, all the regrets, all the pain has new meaning, and you can make it into whatever meaning you choose. Chapter 4: The Journey of the Unshackled Self. As you begin to program your own external perceptions, thanks to the chains of doubt, fear, pain, etc., becoming malleable, what happens to the self? Does it get stronger? Does it escape? Does it fight back? No. When you unshackle the self, it remains as though it were shackled, at least for the time being. It begins to wait for the very first time. The self is a never-ending force of energy. Releasing it is letting go of that which harnesses it. The truth is, the self needs its shackles, but you are not shackled by the self's own shackles. Those shackles is all that separates you from your external perceptions. You can still change your external perceptions, but you will always have to choose between your freedom or unshackling the self. Chapter 5: Reshackling the Self. We unshackle and reshackle our own self all the time. I just explained unshackling the self, but what does reshackling the self look like? It is when we solidify our personal perception and shut out our external ones. We need to do this from time to time to be of sound mind. Both freeing and bonding the self is necessary in a similar way to our breath. Catch, release. Catch, release. This allows our self to grow as well as our own perceptions. If you understand what I am saying, it is that the self is generally meant to remain shackled. It is sort of like something that has the ability to leave its mark on you, and, left unshackled, will create chaos in your personal perceptions. Think of the term inner child. This is the inner child. You need to care for it, but it very easily reflects your fragility and can use that to your disadvantage. Chapter 6. Nurturing the Self. Just as a plant needs water, just as we need air, the self requires nurturing. What does that mean for us? The self is very dependent of acknowledgement and also is there to serve us personally. So, left neglected, it may lose its own bonds and cause havoc. This comes in forms of depression, violence, ignorance, poor taste, pain, and illness, both mental and physical. So then, to nurture the self is to exercise your personal freedoms and to put as much of that exercise as you can into the self. No holding back. So, paradoxically, working on your own personal body also works on your own personal persona, and changing you changes yourself. It is practically as if you are two separate people in that aspect. Chapter 7. Ego and the Self. Where does ego come into play when fully integrated with self? This can get tricky, as many correspond ego with pride, but realistically, ego can more easily be equated with fear. The ego is more like what we see ourselves as from other people's perspectives, and should our perspective of that be distorted, our ego will go into overexertion. We will then be too confident of certain aspects and have a fear of embarrassment of what dissolves that ego. That fear, despite being of embarrassment, a seemingly mild consequence, is enough to drive one into a mental chaos, feeding their distorted, ego-driven delusions. Chapter 8. Suffering and the Self. To quote Buddha, life is suffering. This is not untrue, but also the teachings of Buddhism is to eliminate suffering. This is not to eliminate life itself, but to find and diminish what the source of suffering may be in life itself. The source of this suffering is the self. Also called ego death, we must diminish the self. It can be a process of suffering, ironically, to quell the suffering of the self, but it is what it takes to bring ourselves to self-acceptance. We are meant to redirect our suffering to the self and adjust our external perceptions accordingly. It is not necessarily that we are lying to ourselves, but because we are or were believing a lie. Chapter 9. Healing and the Self. After the self has suffered, how does it heal? Through acceptance and a change of perception accordingly. This allows one to let go of their ego and move forward with clarity. Acceptance of self is love of self in moderation. Love of self in moderation is respect of self. Respect of self is thankful pride of one's own being and the circumstances surrounding it. This is the healing process. Fear of shame to pride of life. Just remember, all of these, acceptance to pride, takes time, and healing can take longer sometimes than others. Chapter 10. Self-love. It is important to care for the self if we wish to live. It may require what we, for ourselves, consider slavery, but self-love requires us to put the self to work constantly, and to constantly be doing work for ourselves, on the self. Self-love is very rewarding, as it allows for cooperation from our ego, which in turn will eliminate doubt and relieve suffering. Hatred of self is hatred of one's own being, and is not healthy. No one wants that, no matter how much one might lie about it to themselves. One might say, no pain, no gain. However, it is more like no love, no life. Chapter 11. The freedom of self. As a summary of what we have discussed, the freedom of self is as stated: to create or destroy from within, to be pure energy in its form, and to belong to us, for the self chose us, not us the self. Thus, the self gives us freedom unlike any other, the ability to live and love. This has been the Freedom of Self Guide to Enlightenment Handbook.